and welcome back. This is the Catholic Lady, and we are reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. Sorry about the short cutoff there. I got a little distracted by my cell phone, which you'd think I would have remembered to turn off. So now we're going to begin with Great Lion of God, Chapter 6, Part 3. He added in one of the Psalms, David says, "When they said, 'Let us go into the house of the Lord,' I was glad." But Saul goes to the house of God like a chained criminal, desirous not only to worship, but less to be chastised. What secret sin has he committed does not deserve so fearful a fate, my poor son? Saul leaned on the rail of the ship and saw the great port of Joppa rising out of the blood-red sea, and standing against a sky as scarlet and as ominous. There was the land of his fathers, the Holy Land, the sacred soil of the prophets, the mountain filled with fire on which God had thundered, the home of the patriarchs, the cradle of the Messiah to come, the matrix in which the Messianic age would be formed, the little land from which would speak the voice which would reconcile the nations and bring eternal peace to the world. There rose the blessed Mount of Zion, and the golden temple, and all the wisdom which would enlighten mankind and lift the darkness in which it lay, groveling like a beast. The thin silver thread of the new moon lifted itself over the sea and into the direful sky. One single star, burning large and gold, stood in the zenith. Now Saul could smell the earth, acrid and spicy and lustful, as the galleon swung toward the harbor. This was an hour he had dreamed of all his life, and he had anticipated his joy and excitement. But he felt no joy, but only an anxious dread. He had no right to step on that soil, a corrupt man, except to atone, to pray that one day he might be forgiven. He knew that among the many passengers also watching the approach of Joppa stood his father and his sister Sephora. He knew his father suffered for him. He knew he had given his father sorrow, and it was an awful pain in him. But how worse a pain, perhaps, if his father guessed the truth? Sometimes a small thought twisted in him that his father might not be so pained, might consider his sin small and trivial and easily forgiven, and might plead his youth and the natural temptations of youth. Perversely, for that very reason, Saul could not confide in Hillel. Worse than the thought of his father's possible pain was the thought of the sin might not pain him at all. He preferred to believe in Hillel's condemnation. As for Sephora, Saul's love for his sister was a misery in his heart. But he could not bring himself to admit that he had been too harsh to her. If she were not restrained now in her wanton behavior, were not taught the precepts of the mothers of Israel, then she was doomed in body and in soul. Better it would be for her to die before she had been corrupted as he had been corrupted. A virgin death was better than a harlot's life. Yet there was an intangible sickness in Saul's thoughts as he contemplated his sister, and he dared not explore the reason. She would marry Ezekiel ben David and be subject to his mother Clodia, rumored to be a just and rigorous, virtuous woman. She would be immured from all the voluptuousness of this present evil world, and all its vices and clamors, its pollutions and its destructions. Saul sought relief in the thought, and when it did not come, he was dismayed. Hillel and Sephora were not avoiding Saul. It was he who was avoiding them. In fact, they had begun to converse amiably with other passengers and the centurion who was the officer of the Roman legionaries. How was it possible for them to be amiable to the enslavers of their country and their people? the despoilers and blasphemers of their land. Saul had never loved Romans. Now he despised and hated them. He glanced sideways along the deck, full of gloom. The vast heavens, the vast sea behind and about them still glowed as if in flames. But the ship's deck was dark, the figures on it dark also. The white sails were lashed with scarlet. Joppa rocked nearer over the burning water, and Saul now saw that the famous harbor was full of ships, small and large, a forest of denuded masts like the bare branches of winter trees. A hot breath blew from the heated land, resinous, perfumed, somewhat putrid, peppery, dusty, reeking of crowded streets and humanity. Plangent sound came over the water, voices, roars, shouts, hard, loud laughter, a sudden ruffle of drums. Now twinkling lights of lanterns appeared on the docks, and the crimson flare of torches, and there, rising and fluttering, in its hugeness, the banner of Rome, its red color almost lost against the red sky. But Saul knew what it was on it. SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome. Blasphemous, incongruous, shameful, frightful, thought Saul ben Hillel, and he beat his fist heavily on the rail of the ship. He could have wept in his anger and hatred and outrage. Someone touched his arm. Hillel said, "We are coming into the harbor. Calm yourself, my son." Hillel's face was pale and shadowy in the light of the celestial conflagration. "It is not to be borne," said Saul through his teeth. "What must be born, said Hillel, and returned to Sephora and her maidens. But the Messiah, blessed be his name, would drive the Romans into the sea as the Egyptians had been drowned, and Rome, that boastful monster of a city, that dragon of a city, foul to the heart of her, dripping with the blood of the conquered, would die in one flash of avenging lightning. The galleon was swaying between the crowded ranks of other ships and vessels in the harbor, and the crew were ready with ropes and anchors. There was much running on the deck, and excited voices from the dangers, and eager laughter. The sailors darted among the heaps of chests, coffers, and pouches belonging to the passengers, and their hoarse and impatient cries were like the voices of foxes. Vultures, black as death and as silent, were wheeling and circling against the redness of the sky. The galleon docked. Beyond the wharfs was the tumultuous city of Joppa, full of lights and torches and clamorous. All at once darkness fell on the earth. The ominous color was gone except for one long ember on the western horizon in which the last scarlet circle of the sun still burned. A dying eye. Amid the flickering of the lanterns and the torches on the decks stood the ubiquitous Roman soldiers, helmeted, the famous short sword fastened to their leather girdles, their legs spread, their faces apparently indifferent, their breasts armored in thick leather. Behind them seethed and fluttered welcoming relatives of the passengers, workers waiting to unload the vessel, and big wagons and asses and yoked oxen. The shifting light of torches splashed them, redly illuminating a face here and then and there, and then plunging into the darkness, catching a waving hand, then losing it. The noise to Saul was overwhelming, the heat unexpected, for all it was autumn. "We have a long journey to Jerusalem," said Hillel, coming to his son again. "We will stay the night in an inn. It is possible that some of our kinsmen may be greeting us. I hoped we could have landed at Caesarea, but there was no ship leaving Tarsus for another 3 weeks, and I wished to spend the high holy days with my people." He thought of Deborah with melancholy. The soldiers would not permit friends and kinsmen to rush upon the ship with the possibility of floundering it, but their captain made way for a group to embark, and Hillel said with happy astonishment, David ben Shabuah and his brother Simon, and that is surely the young Ezekiel, bridegroom of our Sephora, and Joseph ben Shabuah also. And no, it is my dear cousin Hannah's husband, Aulus, the centurion. Hillel's eyes were suddenly filled with tears. His cousin Hannah and her family and her husband were his only living kinsmen, for his had been a family of few children, and he was the last child of his dead parents. It was Aulus himself, the centurion, who was with calm and stately Roman gestures ushering the kinsmen upon the ship, and all the passengers stared to see who was so honored and so conducted. And the captain made his way to greet the Roman officer. Saul looked at him with contempt, in the light of the lanterns now lit on the galleon. Aulus was a man of some 45 years, short but powerful, with a jovial and bearded face under his helmet, big white teeth, a huge nose, and kind, strong brown eyes. He was the first to embrace Hillel, seizing him in his bare arms and kissing his cheek. He smelled of sweat and hearty food and garlic and leather. "My dear Aulus," said Hillel, much moved. "Shalom." "Shalom," said Aulus. He struck Hillel an affectionate blow on the shoulder. "I have come to conduct you to Jerusalem." Then the family of Deborah was upon them, the elegant David scented and urbane, clad in fine wool and silk of purple and gold. The less elegant older brother Simon, but a man evidently well dined and prosperous, and exceedingly plump and jeweled, and arrayed in blue and silver, with an Alexandrine dagger in his girdle. And Joseph ben Shabuah, his twin brother, and almost a replica, but less sleek. All, of course, wore no beards, and all had their sister Deborah's marble complexion, richness of lips, and her blue eyes with auburn lashes, and their uncovered heads showed their tawny hair, carefully arranged, curled, and perfumed in the Greek manner. However, in spite of their jewels and golden garments, Simon and Joseph exuded a certain complacent grossness, an oiled polish, which offended Saul, who waited while his father was lovingly greeted. The youth Ezekiel, but little older than Saul himself, stood apart in shy respect and deference, and Saul saw that he was thin and somewhat small and insignificant, and dark and very Latin in appearance. He had his mother's Roman nose, her definite and prominent profile, but his eyes were the eyes of his father David, like blue and shining. His clothing was not as elaborate and rich as his father's. He wore a long tunic of white linen bordered with gold embroidery, and a brown cowled cloak. There was but one ring on his finger, and no gemmed bracelets clasping his arms, such as clasped the arms of his father and uncles. The family did not cry shalom to their kinsman, as Aulus the Roman had cried. They embraced Hillel calmly and greeted him and made him welcome. They regarded Saul with some curiosity and were polite, and David thought that the youth had not improved in appearance, but indeed had lost that bright color which once had given him an appearance of exuberance. Hillel answered them as gravely and formally. He was somewhat disturbed that the young Ezekiel was with his father David. It was unseemly. A bridegroom did not look upon his bride until the day they were espoused, but the family of Shabuah evidently thought that anachronistic and old-fashioned and unworthy of Sadducees who were civilized and cosmopolitan. Ezekiel was David's youngest son, and not handsome, but he had his mother's virtues and was very intelligent, so David had forgiven him his lack of comeliness. It was unfortunate and a little amusing that the Roman mother had made the youth into a reasonable image of a Pharisee, and had sternly urged upon him his Jewish duties and faith. They are not Jews, thought Saul with bitterness and disdain. They are Hellenistic heathens. He saw Aulus grinning at him amiably, and turned away, and he looked at his sister. She had, to his surprise and approval, dropped her veil over her face, so that her features could be seen but mistily, and her maidens were grouped about her discreetly. But her uncle David lifted the veil aside, and in the mingled lantern and torchlight, all saw her virgin beauty, and Ezekiel, her bridegroom, turned crimson with shyness and admiration. The uncles kissed the girl's cheek, and listened to her whisper of greeting, and were proud of her. "She is as lovely as our lost Deborah," said David, and he thought of the girl's rich dowry. But after a glance at Hillel, he did not bring forward his son. Servants of the house of Shabuah carried the chest and coffers of the travelers to ornate and lavish cars, beside which waited the chariot of Aulus and the horses of his legionnaires. The horses were drawn by Arabian steeds, as black as night, as lustrous as silk, and their harness was silver, and their hoofs gleamed as if shod with silver also. Saul found himself in the car of his uncle Simon ben Shabuah and Ezekiel, and he sat down grimly on yellow silk cushions. The other occupants were two men, servants, who were to do the driving, and they were arrayed in fine linen and were cloaked and helmeted as the soldiers, to Saul's fresh scorn. Now they moved off the docks, the crowd staring, the Roman legionnaires riding about them. A few men made mocking sounds, some of them ribald. Ahead galloped Aulus, and Saul was infuriated to see the banner of Rome unfurled by the soldier who rode at his side. When Ezekiel timidly asked him a question about his journey, he affected not to hear him, but wrapped himself in his dull brown cloak and pulled his hood over his head. Simon saw this and thought that the son of Hillel ben Shabuah resembled a peasant in his manners. Joppa was all about them, hot, with narrow streets, paved with rounded black stones which glistened in the new frail moonlight, and the glare of fluttering torches and crowded. The bazaars were still open. Saul could hear the angry voices of merchants, or their wheeling tones, and he saw women with dark faces and with baskets heaped with fruit on their heads, and oxen and asses, and he could smell the vehement odors of the city. He saw Roman guard towers and Roman soldiers, and the banners of Rome. He saw faces he recognized as Greek and Syrian and Arabian, and other motley races, churning about in the bazaars or hastening through the streets, their voices hoarse, their language incomprehensible. Walls rose and disappeared. There was a scent of hidden gardens, of pine and fountains and manure and roasting meats. Camels turned corners. Their riders glowered at the rich entourage that was sweeping to meet them. Once or twice there was a burst of music and women's laughter and songs from behind walls, or the crying of children. Hillel had said that Joppa resembled Tarsus, but Saul found nothing in this pungent, sweetly fetid air, spicy and hot, of the city of his birth. But it was his land, his country, he told himself. He was a Roman citizen, but he was a Jew above all. This land was flesh of his flesh, blood of his blood, however alien it appeared to him in Joppa. He saw family groups on the flat roofs of some of the houses, which were pale brown in color, with narrow windows and climbed steeply. The gutters were noisome and rank, and evil water ran between the stones. And Saul detected a sudden stench of urine and offal. The light wind had died. The odor of salt was lost as they penetrated farther into the city toward the broad Roman road. They stayed the night in a quiet and comfortable inn, already prepared for them by the family of Shabuah. But Saul lay awake and intense until dawn, his emotions not to be known even by himself, and aware only of a heavy sadness and a solitude of spirit. And that's the end of chapter 6. Thanks. Join us again for chapter 7.